This past week, Xbox made what is quite possibly the most unpopular decision they have in the past decade. And I went back and forth on whether or not I wanted to make a video talking about this, because I feel like it's such a unanimously unpopular thing. There's already, just a lot of talk out there, but I wanted to kind of give my own take on it, go through some of what bothers me about what's going on, what it means for their upcoming showcase, and ultimately what it might mean for the future of the brand. But to begin with, if you're out of the loop on this, if you don't know what I'm talking about, earlier this week, Xbox announced the closure of 3 different studios beneath them, as well as collapsing a 4th one into a support role for other studios. And while layoffs and studio closures are, of course, sad news in general and has been all too common the last year and a half, this particular decision is more confusing because of the specific studios that it has affected, namely Arkane Austin and Tango Gameworks. I want to start with Arkane Austin because of the two, they've been talked about a little bit less, just haven't been focused on quite as much. And part of the reason for this is that their most recent game, Redfall, wasn't exactly a success. It was a game that had a lot of problems at launch. It received a lot of middling to just straight up purely negative reviews, not the largest hit. And some people have pointed to this as being a obvious reason why the studio is being closed down. They had an unsuccessful game, therefore they have to get closed. And that logic really doesn't sit well with me for a few different reasons. First off, just knowing the reports and news that came out after that game's release, we know that that was a very troubled dev cycle. I mean, this was a game that was effectively being made by a team that didn't want to make it. It was a leadership choice to try and experiment and try to do a multiplayer, possibly live service style game. The live service part eventually didn't make part of it. And while I absolutely think it's a great thing for teams to experiment and try new ideas, I'm not saying anything against that. It's kind of important for them to be ideas that the team is actually excited about and interested in working in, which Redfall was not in this case. And so having a team of talent that historically has made some fantastic games outside of their most recent dud, there's this hope and belief of, getting another chance to work on another title that's going to be successful. And historically, that actually should even be the logic of being underneath a large company like Xbox. Part of the point of joining a large team like that and getting bought out and acquired is that you're supposed to have this safety net of, if a particular title ends up not being a big hit for one reason or the other, there is that support and resources to try again and potentially have another hit. I mean, if every studio out there closed after one missed game, the vast majority of the ones that we love today would not be around. What makes this even more frustrating is that, coming out of some articles and interviews since this decision was made, it sounds as if Arkane Austin's goal was even for their next game to go back more to their roots and make a more traditional game in the style that they enjoy making and have been celebrated for making in the past, potentially even being a new entry in the Dishonored franchise. So knowing that there was potential of a new project being something that was a more reliable win from the studio, something that is more within their history and tradition, and that's not getting support after one miss, does not exactly inspire confidence in other dev teams underneath Xbox, especially when one of the things that's been kind of touted over the last couple of years is that, Phil Spencer has said that they want teams to feel like they can focus on their creativity and make the kind of games they want to make and pursue those goals. Which also leads us into the other major studio, and the one that's been even more confusing for a lot of people, Tango Gameworks, for 2 key reasons. One, their last release title, HiFi Rush, is quite possibly the most positive press Xbox has gotten for a game release in the last 5 years, possibly even the last full decade. And not only was that successful, but also prior to closing down, Tango Gameworks was the only Japanese developer underneath Xbox. The reason why these 2 things are so important is that, one, Xbox again has emphasized in the past the idea of wanting to enable teams to do things they want to do and try out different ideas, which HiFi Rush was. I mean, this is a studio that traditionally was known for doing a lot more either horror or at least action horror titles with Evil Within and Ghostwire Tokyo. HiFi Rush was a major course change on that and was a big success. But on top of that, something that Phil Spencer has talked about during his tenure at Xbox a lot is wanting to improve their relations with Japanese devs. Historically, Xbox is a brand that has always struggled in Japan for various reasons, and we've seen repeated attempts to improve relations with teams like Sega, Square Enix, and Capcom that have gone in waves over the last few years. And so to have their own successful Japanese developer and close it down while talking about how you are bemoaning the lack of success Xbox is having in Japan doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And this is what makes this decision so confusing and also kind of damning for the future of Xbox, is just how little sense it makes with other goals that they've stated in the past. Xbox has absolutely made unpopular or controversial choices in the past, but this one feels different precisely because it seems to go entirely against what positive momentum they have been building and things they have stated as their goal. So much so that it doesn't even seem like Xbox leadership themselves can really explain why they did it. As of this recording, in the time since that this announcement was made, Phil Spencer himself has been extremely quiet. There has been no kind of, letter to gamers or announcement or talk about it. In an interview with Bloomberg Tech, Sarah Bond was directly asked why they chose to close Tango Gameworks after having a successful game and effectively gave a non-answer. And Matt Booty, probably the most quotable thing out of this whole thing that's confusing, was the next day after announcing the closure of these studios, talked about how their goal for Xbox's future was to focus on smaller, award-winning titles that would help bring prestige to the Xbox brand. Which, sounds a lot like HiFi Rush, which apparently was only successful enough to get Tango closed. This seeming lack of coordination and clarity has led to a lot of theories about, whether or not this is a decision that actual Xbox leadership chose to make. It has led to some theorizing that perhaps Microsoft up above stepped in and made decisions for them because they needed to cut the bottom line lower. And in fact, this lines up with some interviews and articles that have been coming out around this whole situation. One quote in particular that has gotten very popular comes from an article written by Ryan McCaffrey in which he was interviewing some long-term Xbox employees. And in that interview, one of the employees said that, over the course of time of having conversations with other employees and some people who were founding members of, Xbox since the early days, the current incarnation of the team doesn't feel like Xbox as much as it feels like it's Microsoft gaming. And sure, that makes a certain amount of sense because Microsoft is the company above Xbox, but there's a very important difference in how the tone of that feels, right? Because with Xbox, there is this belief and idea of wanting to make good games and, build a community, whereas when you look at the larger picture with something like Microsoft, it has this much heavier corporate tone to it where it doesn't matter what actually is getting made. All that matters is, what is the return on investment? What is actually making money? And that's exactly the kind of logic that leads to situations like this where someone looks at a spreadsheet and goes, oh, this team, cost us this much, only got us this much in return. Let's just cut that fat right now and move on. Which in a creative field like games is extremely frustrating for so many different reasons, because not only does it discount the entire idea of making actual interesting games that should be celebrated for what they are, but it also ignores the logic of, fostering long-term talent. I mean, if you want a great example of this, something that's kind of been brought up in talks a lot lately is looking at some of successes underneath Nintendo, where, they have people who have worked on the Zelda franchise forever, and that long-term fostered talent and team building that has gone on has allowed for continued success with titles like Tears of the Kingdom. Whereas what we're seeing right now with Xbox is a constant shuffling of talent, and in this case, straight up losing them either after a failed title or seemingly a successful one even. And what makes all of this even more frustrating is the fact that, there's never a good time to announce news like this, but this is a month before their big summer showcase, which is supposed to be a method of, building up hype for the brand and is Xbox's opportunity to show people what stuff is coming out in the near future they should be excited for. And now, because of this, I think there's this just kind of haze hanging over the whole thing of like, yeah, sure, we're gonna see some games and maybe some new announcements and get updates and stuff we've heard about for a while, but for how many studios is that game going to end up being the make or break decision for whether or not Microsoft keeps them around? Especially when we're looking at some of the more kind of mid-tier developers, stuff like Call of Duty, stuff like Bethesda's next Elder Scrolls game or Fallout game, probably feel like they're going to be pretty safe moving ahead because those are the really big names they have to rely on. But when we look at teams like Ninja Theory with Hellblade 2, Obsidian with Avowed and possibly Outer Worlds 2 still, inXile, Double Fine, all these teams that don't necessarily make, massive seller, huge deal, big name games, if HiFi Rush wasn't enough for Tango to stay open, what do these teams need to do to stay relevant? Because when Xbox leadership themselves can't even eloquently explain why Tango had to be closed down, and they have a recent success like that to point to, what does that mean for every other team that isn't working on something like Call of Duty? I've never really considered myself to be a big, platform fan. I've never been one to just specifically shout out for Xbox or PlayStation or even Nintendo. I just like good games. I like following the devs that make stuff that I like, and I want to play the games that they release. And in the past, when we had Xbox going through their whole acquisition spree, I wasn't a huge fan of the idea just because the already huge company buying other huge company, not something I always loved the sight of. And the silver lining that I kept telling myself at the time there was that, well, in this situation, because of the resources that Microsoft and Xbox have, maybe they can help enable developers to focus more on, smaller titles that are a little weirder, a little riskier, but have that opportunity to come out, get made, and released on something like Game Pass. And for a little while, that seemed to be the case. I mean, Pentiment is something that Obsidian released that I could never have seen happening while they were still their own company. And meanwhile, again, Tango Gameworks made HiFi Rush. And so for the past year since those games came out, it felt like that might be something that Xbox could lean more and more into. And as of this past week with that news dropping, kind of just feels like a nail in the coffin of that idea. Look, obviously with also how recent this news is, there's a lot of additional doom and gloom of what this might mean for Xbox moving ahead. There is the slippery slope of just looking at how bad that news is and assuming it can only keep on going. And I hope for Xbox's sake that isn't the case. I want to see more of these developers thrive under them. I want to see more titles come out, and I want to see big wins, because ultimately, I just want good games to play and to have these studios make the stuff they want to make. And while there is certainly still some possibility and potential of that being the case, this past week certainly does not give any sense of confidence to it. So that's just my take on this whole situation. As always, if you found this video to be, useful and informative, hit the thumbs up button to let me know. Subscribe if you want to see some more stuff. I swear, not every video coming up is going to be me talking about the doom and gloom of what's going on in the industry right now. It's just, this was something I really wanted to talk about a bit more. I've got some other stuff on the way soon that's a lot more optimistic, but until then, I'll see you guys later.